What if Naruto traveled to Hunter x Hunter universe? Part 7. Killua stared at his hand as the tiny spark vanished, replaced by a smooth, utterly flawless layer of raw aura that didn't flicker or snap. It was perfectly quiet, dense, and terrifyingly efficient. He looked up at Naruto, a cocky, genuine smirk returning to his face. HMPH. Not bad for an old man. You actually know what you're talking about. Haha, I told you, I'm a tactical genius, believe it. Naruto laughed quietly, punching Killua lightly on the shoulder. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow, Biscuit's probably gonna make you run up a mountain backwards, and you're gonna need that new lightning flow to survive it. The next morning arrived with the subtlety of a collapsing cliffside. Get up, you lazy slugabeds. Biscuit's voice shrieked through the canyon, instantly shattering the morning silence. Before Gon could even blink the sleep from his eyes, Biscuit was standing over them, her frilly skirt swishing as she tapped a heavy wooden staff against the stone floor. Today, we test your progress. We're entering the rocky volcanic crags on the perimeter of Macedora. It's home to the A-rank volcanic golem. If you drop your aura distribution for even a fraction of a second, its magma fists will turn you to ash. A-rank already? Killua groaned, throwing his blanket aside, though as he stood up, his posture was noticeably different. Naruto watched him from the edge of the camp. Killua didn't have his usual frantic, sparking electric current hovering over his skin. Instead, his aura was pulled tightly against his core, perfectly compressed and silent, exactly as they had discussed by the fire. Haha, looks like someone actually took the old man's advice, Naruto teased, slinging his arms behind his head as he strolled up beside them. Shut up, old man, Killua fired back, though a confident, sharp smirk played on his lips. Just watch your own back. The group moved out, transitioning from the dusty canyon into a jagged, brutal landscape of black volcanic rock and sulfurous steam vents. Within an hour, the ground began to rumble violently. From a massive fissure in the earth, a towering behemoth of molten rock and hardened magma rose, its glowing crimson eyes locking onto the intruders. Gone. Killua, frontal assault, Biscuit commanded, stepping back to observe. Maintain your Ryu balance. Gon exploded forward, a brilliant dome of golden enhancer aura erupting around his fist. First comes rock. The golem roared, slamming a massive, molten fist down toward Gon. But before the fist could connect, a sudden streak of absolute silver blurred past Gon's flank. It was Killua. There was no loud crack of lightning, no wasted sparks singeing the air. By internalizing the transmutation process, his movement was completely silent and twice as fast as the day before. He materialized directly alongside the golem's rocky arm, his hands formed into lethal, rigid spears. With a rapid, fluid motion, Killua channeled a hyper-compressed blade of electric current directly through his fingers, slicing cleanly through the golem's molten shoulder joint like a hot knife through butter. Now, Gon! Killua shouted. Jan Ken Rock! Gon's fully charged fist smashed squarely into the core of the staggering golem. The physical impact, backed by a perfectly calculated 80 to 20 aura distribution, shattered the massive creature into a spectacular shower of harmless, cooling stone fragments. Biscuit stood on the ridge, her jaw dropping slightly as she stared at Killua. His aura efficiency, it's completely altered since yesterday. He isn't wasting a single microfraction of his life force on external discharge. How did he master that kind of internal compression overnight? She snapped her gaze over to Naruto, who was leaning against a volcanic rock, a massive, proud grin splitting his face. He caught her look and gave her a casual, two-finger salute. Haha, tell you what, Biscuit, Naruto laughed loudly, walking over to give both Gon and Killua a heavy, enthusiastic smack on their backs. This squad learns faster than anyone I've ever seen. Macedora won't know what hit it. Let's go grab those cards, believe it. After a grueling final sprint through the volcanic crags, the group finally reached Macedora, the city of magic. Leaving Gon and Killua to rest at the local inn, Biscuit immediately dragged Naruto into a quiet, dimly lit tavern on the edge of the rocky city. The tavern smelled of aged wood and local brew. Biscuit slammed her tiny fists onto the heavy oak table, staring up at Naruto with an intensity that could melt iron. All right, Boulder, spill it, Biscuit demanded, her voice a sharp, low hiss. Yesterday, Kahlua was leaking electrical aura like a broken battery. Today, his transmutation is so compressed it's practically silent, and his energy consumption dropped by half. I know what I've taught him, which means you told him something last night. What did you do to his flow? Naruto leaned back in his chair, a relaxed, easygoing grin on his face. He called over the tavern keeper, ordered a giant bowl of local noodles, and turned back to the double-star hunter. Haha, relax, short stack, Naruto chuckled, crossing his arms. I didn't rewrite his nen. I just taught him a basic principle from my world, nature transformation. Killua is a genius, but he was treating his lightning like a suit of armor he had to constantly power from the outside. I told him to stop charging himself like a battery and start changing the quality of his energy at the source, inside his core. Biscuit's eyes widened, her sharp martial arts mind instantly translating the concept. Internalized elemental conversion. That's insane. In Shingen Ryu Kung Fu, we teach that aura must flow smoothly out of the Shoko nodes before it is shaped by the mind. If you force an elemental shift inside the body's internal energy pathways, the raw electrical friction should tear the nervous system to shreds. For a normal guy, yeah, Naruto nodded, his expression turning sharp and serious as his massive bowl of noodles arrived. He snapped his chopsticks apart. But Killua is immune to electricity. His body already knows how to handle the voltage. By forcing the transmutation to happen inside his core channels, he isn't wasting energy fighting the air. He's converting his baseline life force into the lightning element before it leaves his skin. Biscuit leaned forward, her fingers digging deep grooves into the oak table as she gripped the wood. That defies standard Nen mechanics. Nen is the expression of life force. It requires the barrier of the skin to anchor its physical properties when changing form. What you're talking about sounds like bypassing the conversion tax entirely by utilizing a pre-existing physical immunity as a biological catalyst. Exactly. Naruto grinned around a mouthful of noodles. Back home, we call it mixing physical and spiritual energy. If you balance them perfectly, your cells don't just emit power, they become the power. It's all about center of mass compression. Biscuit stared at him, her analytical brain short-circuiting and reassembling itself in real time. She looked at Naruto's heavy frame, realizing that his lack of Nen wasn't a deficit at all. He was constantly operating on a level of internal cellular compression that made her own master-level Ko look like child's play. You really are an ancient monster, aren't you? Biscuit murmured, a fierce, competitive smirk finally returning to her cute face. She reached across the table, snatching a piece of pork right out of Naruto's bowl. Fine, your crazy world theory works for Kahlua because of his weird upbringing. But Gon is a pure, unadulterated enhancer. If you try to teach him your internal compression tricks, he'll explode his own muscles. Hey, that's my meat. Naruto whined dramatically, before his grin turned fiercely confident. And don't worry about Gon. I know exactly how enhancers work, they're just like my friend Lee. When it's time to train Gon's raw output, I've got a whole different textbook to throw at him. Believe it. Before they could even head down to the bustling Macedora market, Naruto pulled Gon and Kahlua to a secluded, rocky clearing just outside the city walls. The volcanic heat of the crags still simmered in the air, but Naruto needed a quiet spot to show them exactly what he meant by mixing physical and spiritual energy. Biscuit followed closely behind, her arms crossed, watching with a highly skeptical eyebrow raised. All right, Boulder, you talked a big game in the tavern about balancing internal energy. Let's see what this different textbook looks like. Haha, get ready, because this is going to look a little weird, Naruto grinned. He walked to the center of the clearing, took a deep breath, and sat down flat on the hard volcanic stone in a lotus position. The energy you guys use, Nen, comes entirely from inside you, Naruto explained, his voice dropping into a calm, steady rhythm. But there's a whole different source of energy floating around us right now. The energy of the earth, the sky, the wind, and the rocks. We call it natural energy. Gon's eyes went wide. Natural energy? Like The forest and the mountains have their own aura? Exactly, Gon, Naruto nodded, keeping his eyes closed. To use it, I have to sit completely still. I have to draw that outside energy into my body and mix it perfectly with my own physical and spiritual energy. If I draw too little, nothing happens. If I draw too much. He opened one eye and smirked. I turn into a literal stone frog forever. A frog? Kahlua blurted out, taking a cautious step back. You're kidding, right? Nope. Dead serious, Naruto chuckled. He closed his eye again, his breathing slowing until it was almost imperceptible. For a few seconds, the wind seemed to die down. The ambient temperature in the clearing subtly dropped. Suddenly, the space around Naruto began to warp. Biscuit's eyes went completely wide. Her veteran Nen user senses, highly attuned to the environment, picked up a sudden, massive shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't that Naruto was releasing aura, it was as if the entire rocky canyon was giving its weight to him. The air grew incredibly heavy, and a profound, ancient pressure settled over the clearing. Slowly, the physical changes manifested on Naruto's face. The skin around his eyes flushed into a brilliant, warm orange pigmentation. When his eyelids finally snapped open, his regular blue eyes were gone. In their place were striking, horizontal, gold and black toad-like pupils. Whoa, Gon whispered, his jaw completely dropping as he stared at Naruto's eyes. Your eyes, they look just like a forest predator. But, the energy around you feels so warm. It feels like the earth itself is protecting you. This is Sage Mode, Naruto said. His voice carried a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to echo slightly off the canyon walls. Kahlua took a step forward, his analytical mind trying to process the sheer scale of what he was looking at. I don't feel any Nen, but my instincts are screaming at me that if I try to touch you right now, I'll get blown away. Your presence, it's like you're not even a single person anymore. You're part of the whole mountain. Smart kid, Naruto praised, his golden toad eyes shifting to Kahlua. In this mode, my sensory grid is so wide I can feel the movement of every insect in Macedora. My physical strength, speed, and durability shoot through the roof. And the best part? I don't even have to make physical contact to hit you. The natural energy around my fists acts as an invisible extension of my body. We call it frog kumite. Biscuit stood frozen, her frilly skirt fluttering slightly in the silent, heavy pressure radiating from the blonde ninja. For the first time in 50 years, she felt genuinely dwarfed by a martial art she didn't understand. He's not just compressing his own cells. Biscuit realized, a cold sweat running down her neck. He is literally drawing the kinetic potential of the entire planet into his physical frame. This isn't just advanced. This is divine. Naruto stood up slowly, the orange markings around his eyes glowing faintly in the afternoon light. He flashed his signature, goofy grin, though the horizontal toad eyes made it look incredibly fierce. Now that you've seen what true balance looks like, Naruto said, slamming his fists together to create a loud, booming shockwave of natural pressure. Let's go find those cards in Macedora and see if anyone's brave enough to try and take them from us. Believe it, the high-altitude sun beat down on Macedora's bustling central market, casting sharp shadows across the sandstone architecture. The city was a sprawling hub of neon signs, magical shops, and players bartering over rare spell cards. Naruto, still maintaining a faint, passive residue of Sage Mode, manifested as a hyper-keen sensory awareness rather than the full physical transformation, walked between Gon and Kahlua as they browsed a stall selling tracking spells. Biscuit trailed slightly behind them, her eyes darting over the crowds like a hawk. Suddenly, Naruto's shoulders went rigid. The warmth of the surrounding natural energy violently curdled. In his sensory grid, 3 distinct signatures stepped into the market square from a side alley. It wasn't the sloppy, desperate energy of the rookie hunters they had encountered at the starting gate. This energy was cold, deeply twisted, and reeked of absolute malice. It felt exactly like the lingering residue of a killer who took immense pleasure in watching their victims bleed. Stop, Naruto said, his voice dropping an octave. Gon and Kahlua halted instantly, their battle instincts flaring at Naruto's shift in tone. Killua's eyes narrowed into razor slits, his internalized lightning flow tightening against his core in a microsecond. You feel it too? Kahlua whispered, his gaze scanning the crowd. It's thick. Like blood. Yeah, Gon said, his face hardening as he looked toward the center of the square. It feels wrong. Emerging from the crowd were three men. In the center walked a tall, gaunt man with short, neat hair and thin-rimmed glasses, wearing a pristine trench coat. He carried himself with the calm, terrifying confidence of an apex predator. Flanking him were two heavily built associates, their eyes cold and calculating as they scanned the market. It was Genthru, the bomber, and his inner circle. Genthru paused, his eyes sliding over the bustling players until they landed squarely on the trio. He didn't unleash his aura. To a regular Nen user, he looked like just another high-level player going about his day. But to Naruto's sage sensory grid and the boy's acute instincts, the invisible pressure radiating from him was suffocating. Inside Naruto's mindscape, Kurama bared his massive fangs, a low, vicious snarl vibrating through the water. Brat, that one in the glasses. He's got the stench of an executioner. The energy in his hands is fluctuating with explosive volatility. He's hiding a lethal trigger. Yeah, he's a walking bomb, Naruto thought back, his blue eyes locking onto Genthru with absolute focus. Genthru offered a polite, thoroughly artificial smile as he adjusted his glasses, stepping a few paces closer. Well, you three must be the highly talked about rookies who bypassed Sesgera's screening so spectacularly. I am Genthru. My associates and I are part of a large coalition working to clear the game peacefully. We're always looking for talented individuals to join our alliance. He extended a hand toward Gon. Before Gon could even move, Naruto stepped directly into the space between them, swatting Genthru's hand away with a blunt, heavy slap of his palm. The physical density of Naruto's touch was so immense that Genthru's wrist visibly shuddered from the kinetic feedback, his artificial smile faltering for a fraction of a second. We're not interested in alliances with guys who hide explosives in their pockets, Naruto said, his voice ringing out clearly over the market chatter. He didn't yell, but the absolute gravity of his presence made the nearest merchants freeze. I've fought plenty of people like you, Glasses. You smile while you're counting down the seconds to backstab your friends. Take your crew and keep walking. Kahlua stepped up to Naruto's left flank, a faint, terrifying hum of high-voltage intent radiating from his silent posture. Gon stepped to the right, his jaw set, his golden brown eyes burning with a righteous anger that perfectly matched Naruto's stance. Genthru slowly retracted his hand, his eyes darkening behind his lenses as his true, murderous nature briefly leaked through his polite facade. The air between the two groups grew violently tense, the ambient Nen in the square starting to ripple like a disturbed pond. Is that so? Genthru murmured, his voice turning ice-cold as his associates shifted their weight to their heels. A shame. In a game like this, independence usually leads to an early grave. Now, let's not make a scene in public, a sweet, childlike voice chirped. Before Genthru's associates could advance another inch, Biscuit strolled effortlessly into the dead space between the two opposing forces. She stood with her hands clasped behind her frilly pink dress, looking up at Genthru with a wide, deceptively innocent smile. The market is for shopping, not for boys playing with fire, she said softly. Genthru's eyes flicked down to her, his brow twitching slightly with annoyance. Step aside, little girl. This doesn't concern. He didn't finish the sentence. Shing. The sound wasn't physical, it was the psychological ring of raw, concentrated terror striking the central nervous system of everyone within 100 yards. For a single, micro-fraction of a second, Biscuit unleashed her Ren. It wasn't a sloppy explosion of energy. It was a razor-thin, hyper-compressed pulse of 50 years of absolute martial mastery. The sheer density of her aura didn't just flare, it solidified into a physical weight that warped the air. The temperature in the immediate vicinity plummeted. To Genthru and his men, the illusion of the cute little girl in the pink dress vanished instantly, replaced by the towering, suffocating shadow of an absolute giant whose physical strength could grind stone to dust. A nearby stone pillar cracked under the sudden atmospheric spike. Several veteran players at neighboring stalls collapsed straight to their knees, gasping for breath as their survival instincts screamed at them to flee. Genthru's breath caught in his throat. His pupils dilated to the size of pinpricks, and his hand, which had been subtly drifting toward his pocket to prep his explosive little flower ability, froze entirely. A cold bead of sweat rolled down his temple. What is this monster? Genthru's mind raced, his internal threat calculator completely shattering. This isn't just high-level Nen. This is a master of the Shingen Ryu. If I try to trigger an explosion, she'll tear my arms off before the spark even ignites. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the crushing pressure vanished. Biscuit was back to smiling, her hands clasped neatly behind her back, tilting her head cutely. My boys and I have a lot of shopping to do, Biscuit said, her voice dripping with sweet, venomous politeness. So if you'll excuse us, we'll be on our way. Unless, you wanted to register us into your little alliance? Genthru swallowed hard, his throat dry. He slowly took a step back, his calculated arrogance completely evaporating into survival mode. He knew when he was hopelessly outmatched. If they fought here, his entire squad would be wiped off the census before sundown. No, Genthru managed, forcing his polite mask back on, though his voice was noticeably tighter. I see you have a very capable party. My apologies for the intrusion. Let's go. Without looking back, Genthru and his two associates turned on their heels and rapidly disappeared into the crowded market stalls, their steps frantic and hurried. Phew, Naruto whistled, leaning back and resting his hands behind his head as he grinned down at Biscuit. Nice one, short stack. You almost had those guys wetting their pants. Your pressure is seriously no joke. Reminds me of Grandma Tsunade when someone messes up her betting tabs. Who are you calling Grandma, Boulder? Biscuit snapped, her cute facade instantly cracking as she shook a tiny, threatening fist at him. I just saved us a giant mess. If you idiots start a war in the middle of town, we'll never get our cards sorted. Kahlua let out a low breath, his tense posture relaxing as his silent lightning current subsided. She's right. Genthru is dangerous, but fighting him now would have drawn the attention of every player killer on the island. We need to complete the training first. Yeah, Gon agreed, his eyes shining with excitement as he looked at Biscuit. That was amazing, Biscuit. Teach us how to make our aura feel that heavy. HMPH. Don't worry, you too, Biscuit smirked, turning toward the card shops. By the time I'm done with you, your aura won't just feel heavy, it'll be absolutely crushing. Now, let's go buy our spell cards. We have a lot of ground to cover, believe it. Hey, that's my line. Naruto laughed, running to catch up as the squad moved deeper into the city of magic. The group bypassed the crowded stalls, stepping into the dim, leather-scented interior of a high-end spell shop. While Gon and Kahlua eagerly began examining the physical properties of the cards on display, Naruto lingered near the doorway. The brief encounter with Genthru had left a sour taste in his mouth. Naruto's sensory grid was still buzzing with the malicious intent Genthru had leaked. It was a familiar, oily feeling, the kind of dark, calculating bloodlust that belonged to people who treated human lives like disposable resources. Inside his mindscape, the water rippled. Brat, Kurama rumbled, his giant claws scraping against the seal. That glass-wearing bastard isn't going to let this go. He's already tracking us. I can feel a faint, sticky thread of intent latching onto your coordinate tags. Yeah, Naruto thought, his expression flattening as his playful, goofy demeanor evaporated. He thinks he's the predator here. He's used to bullying kids who are terrified of his little firecrackers. Without warning, the warm, vibrant air of the shop seemed to grow incredibly cold and still. Biscuit, who was in the middle of lecturing Gon on the difference between a company and magnetic force cards, suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She whipped her head around, her eyes widening as she stared at Naruto. Naruto hadn't summoned his orange sage markings. He hadn't drawn on Kurama's boiling red chakra. He simply stopped holding back his baseline presence. This was the quiet, terrifying gravity of the hero of the Leaf, the man who had stared down gods, commanded entire shinobi alliances, and carries the collective weight of a world's peace on his shoulders. When Naruto went mid-serious, the childish, knucklehead facade peeled away, revealing a seasoned, battle-hardened commander who had survived absolute hell. The ambient natural energy in the shop didn't just flow, it locked into place, forming an invisible, pressurized vacuum around Naruto's frame. The glass display cases rattled in their wooden frames under the sheer, silent weight of his intent. Naruto, Gon asked quietly, taking a half-step back, sensing the shift immediately. It was a pressure entirely different from Biscuit's sharp ren. Biscuit's aura was like a massive stone fist. Naruto's presence felt like standing at the edge of an active volcano right before it erupted. "Kahlua," Naruto said, his voice quiet, steady, and completely devoid of its usual playful pitch. "Are those guys still lingering outside?" Kahlua, his own assassin instincts screaming at the sudden change in his friend, closed his eyes for a split second to check his sensory range. "Yeah, 2 of Genthru's scouts are stationed at the alleyway entrance. They're trying to keep tabs on which cards we buy. They're trying to set up a trap for when we leave the city limits," Naruto said smoothly, walking toward the shop's threshold. He didn't look back at them. "Biscuit, keep Gon and Kahlua inside for 5 minutes. Wait, Boulder," Biscuit called out, her voice losing its usual commanding edge, replaced by genuine caution. "You can't just engage them in the open streets. The game's system." "I'm not going to fight them," Naruto interrupted, sliding his hands into his pockets as he stepped out into the bright sunlight of the alleyway. "I'm just going to set some boundaries." The 2 scouts Genthru had left behind were leaning against a sandstone wall, pretending to browse a nearby fruit stand. The moment Naruto stepped into the alley, they tense up, their hands drifting toward their pockets to prep their defensive spell cards. Before their fingers could even touch the leather of their binders, Naruto materialized directly between them. Whoosh! There was no sound of shifting stone, no burst of speed, just a sudden, absolute displacement of space. Naruto stood with his head slightly bowed, the shadow of his spiky hair obscuring his eyes. The 2 scouts froze, their breath instantly catching in their throats. The sheer, suffocating density of Naruto's physical mass, backed by the passive natural energy he was drawing from the stone alley, made it feel like the gravity in the corridor had just multiplied tenfold. Their knees trembled under the invisible weight. "Listen to me very carefully," Naruto said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate directly inside their skulls. He slowly raised his head, his blue eyes icy, sharp, and completely focused. "Tell your boss that we aren't here to play his game. If he keeps trying to track us, or if he even thinks about using those explosives near my team." Naruto reached out, his hand moving so fast it was a mere blur. He lightly tapped the solid sandstone wall of the alley with his index finger. Boom! Without a single drop of nen, the pure, raw kinetic force of his compressed physical muscle shattered the stone. A web of deep, violent fractures raced up the entire 3-story building, sending a shower of dust and gravel over the 2 terrified players. "I won't just break his cards," Naruto finished, his voice deadly calm as he looked them dead in the eye. "I'll break him. Now go tell him." The 2 scouts didn't even bother to use a spell card. They scrambled backward, slipping over their own feet in absolute, primal terror, before sprinting out of the alleyway as if the devil himself was chasing them. Naruto stood in the settling dust, his shoulders relaxing as he let the intense pressure fade back into his core, his usual bright, easygoing grin slowly returning to his face. He turned back toward the shop door, where Biscuit, Gon, and Kahlua were standing, staring at him in stunned silence. "All right," Naruto laughed loudly, throwing his arms behind his head. "Now that the pests are cleared out, let's go get those travel cards, believe it." The dust from the shattered sandstone wall had barely settled in Macedora before the group was back in the rugged, volcanic wilderness. Gon stood in the center of a barren ravine, his feet planted wide. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep breath as he began to pull his aura into his right fist. "First comes rock," Gon chanted, his voice echoing. A massive, bright golden flame of enhancer aura erupted around his hand, flickering violently. But as the seconds ticked by, the aura began to bleed off, heat waves warping the air around him. The charge time was dragging, leaving his entire body completely defenseless. By the time he could scream, rock, and punch a massive boulder, the strike, while incredibly powerful, had taken nearly 5 full seconds to prep. Hold on, hold on. Stop right there, Gon, Naruto interrupted, waving his hands to signal a timeout. You're trying to figure this out like a math problem, and that's only gonna make your brain itch. Let me explain it the way my master taught me. Naruto's eyes softened, a fond, slightly mischievous grin spreading across his face. I had this teacher, we called him the pervy sage, Naruto chuckled, ignoring Killua's raised eyebrow. He was a total weirdo who spent half his time peeping on hot springs, but when it came to fighting, he was a legendary master. When he taught me how to compress my energy, he didn't use big fancy words. He bought me a couple of cheap toys from a street festival and told me to get to work. Naruto reached down, picking up a small, round volcanic stone to use as a visual aid, tossing it lightly in his hand. He told me that compressing your energy into a devastating, rapid-fire blow isn't about forcing it to sit still. It's about managing a riot inside your own hand. Here is how he broke it down. The Pervy Sage's 3 stages. 1. Stage 1. The water balloon, rotation, stir the storm. Imagine your hand is a balloon completely filled with water. If you just push your aura into it, it stays still. If you spin it in one direction, it just swirls. You have to make the energy spin in multiple, conflicting directions all at once, up, down, left, right. You keep churning it faster and faster until the chaotic pressure pops the balloon from the inside. 2. Stage 2. The rubber ball, power, shred the core. Once you can spin the energy, you have to make it dense. Imagine replacing that water balloon with a thick, solid rubber ball. Just spinning your aura won't do anything to something that tough. You have to pump 100 times more raw, violent power into that rotation. You have to make the spinning friction so intense that it literally shreds the rubber from the inside out. 3. Stage 3. The balloon skin, containment, lock the valve. This is the hardest part. You have both rotation and massive power, but if you let it loose, it just blows away in the wind. You have to create a thin, unbreakable, perfectly round skin of aura right over your knuckles to hold that entire raging storm inside. Keep it completely contained, perfectly balanced, and don't let a single drop leak until your fist hits the target. Gon listened, his eyes wide and completely locked on Naruto. The abstract concepts of Nen flow suddenly vanished, replaced by the vivid image of a water balloon churning and bursting in his palm. A water balloon, Gon muttered, slowly raising his right hand. He closed his eyes, his breathing leveling out. Instead of just forcing his aura to pool statically like he usually did, he pictured the liquid inside his hand. He began to stir it. In his mind, he whipped the aura clockwise, then violently cut it with a counterclockwise current, forcing the energy to collide and frictionize against itself. ZZZZZT. A sharp, high-pitched hum cut through the ravine. Look at his hand, Killua whispered, stepping closer, his sharp eyes widening. The golden aura around Gon's fist wasn't leaking or wavering anymore. It was pulling tightly against his skin, spiraling in a chaotic, blurring vortex that was violently sucking in the loose dust around his boots. He was keeping the storm perfectly contained inside the balloon skin of his own Nen. He's got it, Biscuit whispered, her jaw dropping slightly. He skipped the entire 5-second build-up. The sheer kinetic speed of the internal rotation is generating the destructive force instantly. Now, Gon, pop the skin on impact. Naruto shouted. With a fierce battle cry, Gon drove his fist straight into a massive, jagged basalt boulder. Rock. Boom. The impact didn't just shatter the boulder. It literally pulverized the solid stone into a fine, swirling mist of black sand, a massive shockwave of wind blasting outward and rattling the canyon walls. Gon stood in the clearing, a massive, brilliant grin on his face as he looked at his completely uninjured hand. I did it, Naruto, that makes so much more sense. The water balloon trick worked perfectly. Ha ha, I knew you'd get it. Naruto laughed loudly, running over to give Gon a heavy high five. The pervy sage's lessons never fail, believe it. The roaring triumph of the afternoon training session slowly faded into a quiet, crisp desert night. Above the deep volcanic ravine, the sky opened up into a brilliant tapestry of stars, completely untouched by the neon glow of Macedora. In the center of their small hollow, a modest campfire crackled, sending orange sparks drifting up into the darkness. Gon was already curled up on his sleeping bag, completely exhausted but wearing a faint, satisfied smile even in his sleep. Biscuit had retreated to her tent, though the faint silhouette of her reading a magazine was visible against the fabric. Kahlua sat on a smooth basalt rock opposite Naruto, hugging his knees to his chest. He stared silently into the dancing flames, a stick held loosely in one hand as he poked at a glowing ember. "Hey, Naruto," Kahlua said, his voice unusually quiet so as not to wake Gon. "You called him a legendary master, but you also called him a pervert who spent his time peeping on hot springs. And you talked about a ninja world where you had to compete to survive." He looked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto Naruto's face. "In our world, people think of ninjas as just characters in old folk stories, or low-level stealth specialists. But my family, the Zoldikes, we're assassins. We train our kids to kill from the moment they can walk. It's cold, calculated, and strictly business." Kahlua hesitated, his voice dropping slightly. "But the way you talk about your master, and your home, it sounds different. What kind of place did you actually come from?" Naruto's goofy grin softened into something deeply nostalgic, yet heavy with the weight of a lifetime of battles. He leaned back against a rock, looking up at the foreign stars. "Well, back home, ninja weren't just guys hiding in the dark to slit throats," Naruto said softly. "We had entire hidden villages built around being shinobi. It was our military power, our culture, and our home. But for a really long time, we were locked in a cycle of absolute hatred. Before the villages were even built, there were no countries, just clans. If a lord hired one clan, the enemy hired another. Kids who weren't even 10 years old were handed swords and sent to die on the front lines." The next morning, the smell of sulfur and crisp desert air woke the group early. Naruto was already up, sitting cross-legged by the extinguished fire pit, staring intently at the floating glowing book tethered to his wrist. "Book," Naruto muttered, and the thick leather binder materialized. But it didn't look like Gon's or Killua's. The edges of the pages were faintly rippling with a strange distortion effect, like looking through a wall of hot, rising steam. "Hey, old man, what are you staring at?" Kahlua asked, yawning as he stretched his arms. Gon was right behind him, rubbing his eyes. "My binder is acting totally weird," Naruto said, scratching the back of his head. "Look at this slot layout." Gon and Kahlua leaned over his shoulder, and even Biscuit stepped out of her tent, her sharp eyes narrowing instantly. A standard Greed Island binder had 100 specified slots and 45 free slots. But Naruto's book was completely warped. The grid lines were flickering between glowing yellow chakra script and the game's digital code. Half of the specified slots had completely melted away, merged into a single, massive, volatile container labeled Slot 000, out of bounds artifact. "That's impossible," Kahlua whispered, tapping the glowing screen. "The game's registry runs on absolute programming rules dictated by the creator's Nen. It shouldn't be able to glitch like this unless his very existence is a systemic anomaly," Biscuit finished, stepping closer and touching the distorted page. She felt a faint, thrumming vibration, not of Nen, but of ancient, coiled natural energy reacting aggressively to the game's simulated constraints. "When you entered this world, Naruto, you didn't pass through the standard terminal. The game is trying to categorize your internal energy as a card effect, and it's short-circuiting the item registry." "Wait, so what happens if I do this?" Naruto asked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a standard gain card they had acquired the day before, a basic item card meant to materialize a clean canteen of water. The moment Naruto slid the card into the glitched slot, the book let out a sharp, electric zap. The card didn't turn into a canteen. Instead, the card's digital ink literally ran down the page, dissolving into a pool of glowing blue light before being violently pulled into Naruto's palm. A sudden, small shockwave of wind blew outward, knocking over their empty stew pot. Whoa! Gon shouted, shielding his eyes. What did it do? Naruto stared down at his hand. He didn't have a canteen. But his eyes went wide as he flexed his fingers. The card, it didn't give me an item. It just converted the game's data directly into raw physical energy. My baseline stamina just topped off like I slept for a whole week. Killua's analytical mind immediately put the pieces together. Because your binder is glitched, it can't process the materialization command of the card. Instead, it's breaking the item back down into its raw energetic components, the nen used by the game's creators to make it, and your body is absorbing it as pure fuel. A systemic siphon, Biscuit murmured, a brilliant, terrifying grin slowly spreading across her face as she looked at Naruto. Do you know what this means, Boulder? While Gon and Killua have to play by the rules to collect items, your book is a universal recycler. Any spell card thrown at you, or any card you find, can be broken down to replenish your own massive reserves. Ha ha, so I'm basically a walking cheat code. Naruto laughed loudly, slamming his fist into his palm as his vibrant energy flared. Man, the guys back home are never gonna believe this. Let's see what happens when we feed it a high rank card, believe it. Killua's posture stiffened. The description hit painfully close to home, bringing back memories of the cold, dark testing chambers of Kukuru Mountain. How did it stop? Killua asked. Two guys who got tired of burying their siblings shook hands and decided to build a village where children would never have to fight, Naruto said, a proud smile touching his lips. That was how my home, the Hidden Leaf Village, was born. But even then, the peace didn't last forever. We fought 3 massive world wars before I was even born. Everyone wanted revenge. You kill my friend, I kill yours. It just kept spinning. Naruto looked back down at the fire, his eyes reflecting the warm embers. That's where the pervy sage came in. Jiraiya didn't just travel to write his books. He traveled the world trying to find a way to break that cycle. He believed with everything he had that one day, people would truly understand each other and the fighting would stop. He was a legendary warrior, but his real strength was his heart. When everyone in my village hated me and called me a monster because of the beast sealed inside me. Naruto tapped his chest. Jiraiya was the first one who looked at me and just saw me. He became my godfather, my teacher, and my family. Did he fight with you in the war? Killua asked quietly. No, Naruto's voice grew thick, but steady. He died before it started. He went on a solo mission to gather info on the enemy. He fought 6 of the strongest opponents we'd ever faced, completely alone. Even after his throat was crushed and his arm was severed, he forced his heart to beat one last time to write a coded message on his partner's back so we could win. A heavy silence settled over the campfire, punctuated only by the crackle of the wood. I wanted to give up when he died, Naruto admitted, looking directly at Killua. But I realized that the only way to honor him was to carry his dream. To choose a path of peace, no matter how hard it got. You're an assassin because of where you were born, Killua. But you don't have to stay in that shadow. You chose to be Gon's friend. That means you've already started choosing your own path. Killua stared at Naruto, his breath catching. He looked away quickly, a faint, embarrassed flush on his cheeks as he scoffed softly and tossed his stick into the fire. Yeah, whatever. I'm just along for the ride so this idiot doesn't get himself killed. But as he looked back at the sleeping Gon, a genuine, relaxed smile finally reached Killua's eyes. All right, enough of the mushy stuff. Naruto laughed, his booming, energetic voice returning as he ladled 2 bowls of hot stew. Eat up, lightning boy. Tomorrow, Biscuit is definitely gonna make us pay for this peaceful moment, believe it. Wait a second, Killua muttered, his eyes darting from Naruto's glitched book to the surrounding canyon walls. His assassin brain was already calculating 3 steps ahead. If your binder is treating the game's programmed nen cards as raw data and absorbing them, what about the spell cards other players use? Gon tilted his head, a giant question mark practically hovering over his spiky hair. What do you mean, Killua? Think about it, Killua said, his voice dropping into a sharp, low whisper. Every time Genthru or his guys use a tracking spell like Trace or Adhesion to keep tabs on players, the game has to establish a continuous energetic link between the caster and the target. To the game's system, that link is just a stream of active code. But to Naruto's glitched book, it's an open connection, Biscuit realized, her eyes widening as she caught on. The out-of-bounds registry won't just block the signal, it will trace the carrier wave straight back to the source. Exactly, Killua smirked, a dangerous, cold glint returning to his eyes. The bomber thinks he's the one playing shadow games. Let's turn his own tracking network into a beacon. Naruto, pull up the glitched slot again. Naruto grinned, liking the sound of a counter-offensive. You got it. He summoned his warp binder, flipping to the back where the distorted, steam-like, slot 000, sat, flickering erratically. Killua reached out, gently pressing his thumb against the edge of the screen, channeling a tiny, highly controlled pulse of his internalized, silent lightning aura. The high-frequency electricity acted like a tuning fork, agitating the glitched interface. The screen suddenly flashed violently. The yellow chakra script and the game's digital code began to spin, merging into a crude, glowing radar grid right on the leather page. 3 distinct, pulsing red markers materialized on the map, far to the south, moving slowly through the rocky plains outside Macedora. I've got them, Naruto said, his voice dropping into its serious, quiet register. The passive natural energy around him surged, locking the coordinates into his mind. 3 signatures. The cold, volatile one in the middle is definitely Glasses. They're tailing another group of players right now. They're hunting, Gon said, his face hardening instantly as he tightened his fists, the newly refined, spinning Jajunkin aura humming quietly around his knuckles. We have to stop them before they hurt anyone else. No arguments here, Naruto said, closing his binder with a sharp snap and slinging his heavy orange jacket over his shoulder. He looked over at Killua and Gon, a fierce, determined smirk on his face. The hunter just became the prey. Let's go crash their party, believe it. They sprinted out of the volcanic hollow, kicking up trails of red dust as they closed the distance toward the south. The red markers on Naruto's glitched book were pulsing faster, indicating Genthru's group was stationary. They had cornered their prey. Suddenly, Naruto skidded to a halt on a high ridge overlooking a narrow, craggy gorge. He closed the book with a soft sigh, but instead of his usual pumped-up, grinning face, his shoulders slouched. He rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a long, theatrical yawn. Man, what a drag, Naruto muttered, his eyes half losing their spark as he looked down at the canyon. Why do these guys always have to make things so incredibly troublesome? Killua nearly tripped over his own feet, stopping and staring at Naruto like he had grown a second head. What did you just say? Where did the "let's crash their party" guy go? No, he's right, Biscuit said, landing silently beside them, her eyes scanning the gorge below. If we just barge in there headfirst, Genthru will use his escape cards or detonate his traps before we can pin him down. We need a strategy. Naruto slumped down onto a flat boulder, sitting with his legs crossed. But instead of his usual restless shifting, he closed his eyes, brought his hands together, and connected his fingers to form a loose, inverted canopy shape, the exact thinking pose of a lazy, genius shadow manipulator from the leaf. Seriously, planning is such a pain, Naruto grumbled, his voice mimicking Shikamaru's slow, deadpan drawl. But if we don't do this right, we're just wasting energy. I used to watch a guy back home do this all the time. He was a genius, but man, he made complaining into an art form. Gon leaned in, completely fascinated. Are you doing a strategy pose, Naruto? Yeah, Naruto muttered, his eyes cracking open, suddenly sharp despite his slouched posture. Listen up. The gorge below has only 2 exits. Genthru and his 2 lackeys have a group of 5 players cornered against the rock wall. If we charge from the front, the lackeys will act as shields while Genthru activates his little flower or slips away using a spell. We have to limit his choices. Killua's eyebrows shot up. Go on. It's simple, really, Naruto said, his fingers entangling as he pointed down at the rocky terrain. Kahlua, you take the high ground. Your new silent lightning makes you completely invisible in the shadows of those upper ridges. You're our net. If anyone tries to use a movement card to fly out, you short-circuit it before they can even read the spell. Kahlua smirked, his knuckles twitching. Consider it done. Gon, you're the hammer, Naruto continued, standing up and stretching his back with another lazy sigh. You loop around to the southern exit. When I give the signal, you don't fight them, you just smash the canyon wall. Block their exit with a rockslide. That leaves them trapped in the center. And what are you going to do? Biscuit asked, a look of profound approval crossing her face as she watched Naruto lay out a flawless tactical chokehold. Me? Naruto sighed again, cracking his neck. I'm going to walk right down the middle and be the bait. I'll make so much noise they won't even think to look up or behind them. Once they're boxed in, we pressure them into making a sloppy mistake. He slung his arms behind his head, turning to walk down the sloping path. Honestly, I'd rather be taking a nap under a shady tree watching the clouds go by. But I guess we should get this over with. Down in the shadowy floor of the gorge, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Genthru stood before a terrified, trembling squad of 5 rookie players, his pristine trench coat catching the draft of the canyon. One of his associates had a heavy hand planted on a young player's shoulder, while Genthru casually held a rare card between 2 fingers. I'll ask one last time, Genthru said, his voice dripping with sweet, terrifying politeness as his glasses caught the light. Hand over your card binders, or my friend here will show you what a real explosion feels like. Crunch. The sound of a loose pebble shifting echoed loudly through the narrow gorge. Genthru's head snapped toward the entrance. His 2 associates instantly dropped into defensive stances, their hands hovering over their pockets. Strolling lazily out of the dust, hands tucked into his orange pants, was Naruto. He didn't have his weapons out. He didn't even look angry. In fact, he looked incredibly bored, letting out a massive, theatrical yawn that echoed off the high basalt walls. Man, you guys are so loud, Naruto grumbled, scratching his spiky blonde head as he walked right past the outer perimeter of Genthru's defensive line like they weren't even there. I could hear you screaming about explosions all the way from the ridge. Don't you guys ever take a day off? What a pain. Genthru's polite mask fractured, his eyes narrowing to razor-thin slits. The brat from the market. Where are your friends? Did they abandon you, or did you just stumble in here to die? They're around, Naruto said dismissively, stopping about 15 feet away. He slouched, resting his weight on one leg as he gave Genthru a lazy, half-lidded stare. Honestly, trying to play hero is such a drag. But I promised Gon I'd help him out, and my old buddy back home would never let me hear the end of it if I let a bunch of bullies blow up innocent people. Arrogant fool, one of Genthru's associates snarled, stepping forward with his fist clenched, his nen flaring. We don't need the bomber for this one. I'll take his head myself. I wouldn't do that if I were you, Naruto muttered, not even shifting his stance. He connected his fingers into that loose, inverted canopy shape for just a fraction of a second, his eyes tracking the shadows high above Genthru's head. Right on cue, a faint, almost imperceptible ripple of silent, high-voltage electricity hummed from the craggy ridges above. Kahlua was in position, a silent silver ghost waiting for the signal to drop the net. At the southern exit, a soft vibration rattled the loose gravel under Genthru's feet. Gon had successfully reached the flank, his hand already spinning the chaotic, quiet vortex of his newly refined Jajanken, ready to bring the canyon wall down. Genthru, highly paranoid, felt a sudden cold sweat run down his neck. He looked at Naruto's completely relaxed, slouched posture. It wasn't the posture of a reckless kid. It was the posture of a predator who had already closed the cage door. Wait, Genthru hissed to his associate, his hand snapping out to hold him back. He looked up at the high cliffs, then back to Naruto. There's something wrong here, told Ya. Naruto sighed, his eyes suddenly sharpening, the lazy slouch vanishing as his baseline presence locked onto Genthru like a physical weight. The board is set, glasses. You're completely boxed in, believe it. Now, gone. Naruto yelled, his voice instantly losing its lazy drawl and snapping back to a razor-sharp command. From the southern mouth of the gorge, a blinding flash of golden light cut through the shadows. Gon emerged from the dust, his right fist already humming with a hyper-compressed, violently spinning vortex of aura. The water balloon rotation was so tight it made a sound like a high-velocity jet engine. He didn't waste a single heartbeat on a chant. He just drove his fist straight into the structural weak point of the canyon wall. Rock. Boom. The impact was cataclysmic. Instead of just cracking the stone, the internal kinetic friction of the rotation pulverized the base of the cliffside, sending a massive, roaring wall of thousands of tons of basalt boulders crashing down. Within seconds, the southern exit was completely sealed by a 20-foot barrier of solid rock, choking the canyon in a massive cloud of gray dust. What? Genthru gasped, his eyes widening behind his glasses as the ground beneath him violently shuddered. The exit. Don't look away, losers, a cold, mocking voice rang out from directly above. Before Genthru's two associates could even turn their heads, Kahlua dropped from the high ridge like a silent silver thunderbolt. Because he was internalizing his electricity, he didn't make a sound until the exact moment of impact. He landed squarely between the two lackeys. His hands, stiffened into deadly assassin claws, were cloaked in a high-frequency, pressurized electric current. With twin, blindingly fast strikes, he drove his palms into their chests. Zeet! The massive electrical voltage didn't erupt outward, it blasted directly inward, completely short-circuiting their nervous systems and overloading their aura nodes in a microsecond. Both men froze mid-motion, their eyes rolling back as they collapsed onto the rocky ground, completely neutralized before they could even think about pulling out a card. Two down, Kahlua murmured, flipping backward to stand protectively in front of the terrified rookie players. You're up, Naruto. Genthru was completely alone. His men were down, his exit was blocked, and his heart was hammering against his ribs. Desperate and backed into a corner, his face twisted into a mask of pure, murderous rage. He lunged straight at Naruto, his right hand cloaked in a volatile, sparking aura. Don't underestimate me, you brat! Genthru screamed, thrusting his open palm toward Naruto's face. Little flower. Naruto didn't even flinch. He didn't drop into a defensive stance. He just took a single, deliberate step forward, meeting the explosive attack head-on. Boom! The explosion detonated right against Naruto's chest, a burst of fire and concussive force blowing the dust away in all directions. Genthru smirked, expecting to see charred flesh and shattered bone. But as the smoke cleared, Genthru's smile froze. Naruto stood exactly where he had been, his clothes slightly singed, but his skin completely unmarked. Thanks to his passive absorption of natural energy and his monstrous baseline physical density, the blast hadn't even broken his stride. It felt like a firecracker popping against a brick wall. Is that it? Naruto asked, his blue eyes cold and unyielding as he stared down at the bomber. Your explosives are weak, glasses. You build your whole life around scaring people with cheap tricks. Before Genthru could pull his hand back, Naruto's arm moved like a whip. He grabbed Genthru by the collar of his trench coat, lifting the tall man entirely off his feet with a single hand, completely showcasing the terrifying, effortless strength of his physical frame. Game over, Naruto said quietly. With a blunt, heavy twist of his wrist, he slammed Genthru flat into the hard dirt floor of the canyon, knocking the wind out of him so violently that the bomber's glasses shattered against the stones, leaving him unconscious and completely defeated in the dirt. Naruto let out a long sigh, slouching his shoulders once more as he rubbed the back of his neck. Man, what a drag. Glad that's over with. Let's grab their binders and get back to shopping, believe it. Kahlua walked over, tossing Genthru's dropped binder up and down in his hand before slipping it into his own pocket. That was almost too easy. They completely fell for the slouching routine. Told ya, Naruto said, his voice returning to its usual energetic pitch as he cracked his knuckles. When you act like you'd rather be taking a nap, people get sloppy. My buddy back home used to win entire wars just by complaining about how much his feet hurt. That's a pretty cool trick, Gon said, running over with his eyes wide, looking down at the unconscious bomber. He then looked up at the 20-foot wall of pulverized basalt he had just created. But wow, the water balloon thing really works, Naruto. My hand doesn't even sting. Of course it works. The pervy sage was a genius, Naruto laughed, giving Gon a heavy thud on the back. Now you can throw that punch while you're running, jumping, or even upside down. No more standing around waiting to get kicked in the face. Biscuit strolled out from the settling dust cloud, her arms crossed as she inspected the scene. Her eyes lingered on the two unconscious associates, noting the precise, non-lethal electrical overload Kahlua had delivered. Then she looked at the shattered canyon wall. Not bad, you three, Biscuit conceded, a small, proud smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Your coordination was decent, and you didn't let your target dictate the pace of the battle. But don't get cocky. Genthru was just a big fish in a small pond. The real high-tier players on this island won't stand still for a lecture. Yeah, we get it, short stack, Naruto teased, earning himself a swift, incredibly painful pinch to his forearm from the tiny master. Ow, hey, watch the jacket. The 5 rookie players Genthru had cornered were still huddled against the rock wall, staring at the trio in absolute awe. The leader of their group, a scruffy-looking hunter, slowly stood up, his knees still shaking slightly. You guys, you're the ones from the starting city, he stammered, looking at Naruto. You just took down the bomber's core squad in less than 30 seconds. Who are you? Naruto turned, flashing them a brilliant, reassuring thumbs up. Just a squad trying to finish the game. You guys should head back to Macedora and stock up on defensive cards. It's getting a little wild out here. With the threat neutralized, the team turned back toward the main path leading out of the gorge. Naruto pulled his glitched binder up once more, watching the weird yellow and blue code flicker across the screen. The red markers representing Genthru's crew had completely gone dark, but a new, strange golden prompt was starting to blink at the bottom of his slot 000. Hey, look at this, Naruto pointed to the screen. Kahlua and Gon leaned in. The glitched text was slowly translating itself into legible characters against the leather page. Anomaly detected. System synced with user core. Unlocking localized world data. Clustered around a sturdy wooden table while Biscuit sat back, sipping a cup of tea but keeping her eyes sharp. Kahlua pulled out Genthru's pristine leather binder and laid it flat on the table. With a fluid swipe of his fingers, he unlocked the security registry. Let's see what the bomber was hiding, Kahlua muttered. The binder flew open, and a brilliant cascade of holographic text projected into the air above the table. Row after row of rare, shimmering cards filled the slots. The sheer volume of their collection was staggering. Genthru and his alliance had systematically stripped lesser players of their hard-earned rewards for years. Wow, Gon breathed, his eyes wide as he scanned the lists. They have Paladin's Necklace, Risky Dice, and look, 3 copies of Thyroid Tree. They were really close to finishing the game. Yeah, by stealing from people who couldn't fight back, Naruto grumbled, leaning his chin on his palm. His slouched posture from earlier was mostly gone, but he still looked annoyed at the memory of Genthru's fake smile. It's a drag looking at stuff taken by guys like that. Kahlua, however, wasn't looking at the standard slots. His thumb flicked to the back of Genthru's free pocket registry, stopping on a folded, physical parchment card that didn't have a standard game number. It was glowing with a faint, iridescent violet hue. Hold on, look at this one, Kahlua said, pulling the card out. The card was labeled, Secret Memo, the Creator's Horizon. The moment Kahlua laid it on the table, Naruto's glitched binder, sitting right next to it, let out a low, resonant hum. The yellow chakra script on Naruto's slot 000 flared to life, casting a golden light across the violet card. Suddenly, the text on Genthru's hidden memo began to shift and rewrite itself, responding directly to Naruto's out-of-bounds energy. The glitch is acting like a decoder ring, Biscuit noted, leaning forward with genuine interest. Read it, Kahlua. Kahlua's eyes scanned the newly manifested text. It says, to those who seek the remaining SS rank cards, the standard card conversion formulas are a distraction. Card number 000 and card number 001 cannot be obtained through normal trades. They are anchored to the life force of the game's actual masters located at the northernmost point of the volcanic range, past the Giant's Valley. The game's masters? Gon repeated, his eyes instantly igniting with excitement. You mean Jing's friends? The people who built this whole place with him? Looks like it, Kahlua nodded, a sharp smirk forming on his face. Genthru must have spent months torturing or tricking information out of other veteran players to generate this clue. He was planning an ambush on the creators themselves to force the final cards out of them. Well, he's not ambushing anyone now, Naruto grinned, slouching back in his chair and throwing his arms behind his head. But if those cards are tied to the people who made this place, that means we get to go find them directly. Sounds way better than running around collecting rocks and canteens, believe it. Don't get ahead of yourselves, Biscuit warned, tapping the table firmly. If these cards are held by the creators, the trials to earn them will be exponentially harder than anything you've faced. But with Gon's faster Jajanken, Killua's internal lightning, and whatever ridiculous energy recycling Naruto is doing. She smiled, her eyes flashing with anticipation. I think you're finally ready to leave the training grounds.